August 6th, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. A single flash, and the world changed forever. But here's what they don't tell you in history books. One man, just one man, he was there. And then, 3 days later, August 9th, he was there again. 2 atomic bombs, 2 cities erased from existence, and somehow he walked away from both. Now, before we go any further into this, you're going to want to settle in. Grab your coffee, maybe some tea, get comfortable. Because what you're about to hear, it's not just history, it's something else entirely. This is the kind of story that'll stay with you, the kind that makes you question what humans can actually endure. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, they need to be remembered, they need to be told. And stick with me till the very end, because this man's journey, it gets even more unbelievable as we go. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi, and by the time you finish listening to this, you'll understand why his story is one of the most remarkable survival accounts in all of human history. So let me take you back to 1945, back to a Japan that was, well, it was on its knees. The Second World War had been raging for years, and by the summer of that year, they were desperate. American forces had been pushing closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, island by island, battle by battle. The firebombing campaigns had already destroyed dozens of Japanese cities, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Tokyo had been hit particularly hard in March. The firestorm that night killed more people than either atomic bomb would later claim individually. But still, Japan fought on. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, he was 29 years old that summer. Young man, you know. He worked as a draftsman, a naval engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Nagasaki. Not a soldier, just a regular guy trying to do his job, trying to survive in a country at war. He had a wife, Hisako, and a young son, Katsutoshi, who was just a baby. And like so many Japanese workers during the war, Yamaguchi, he traveled where his company sent him. In the summer of 1945, that meant Hiroshima. Now, Hiroshima, it was a significant city, you understand. About 350,000 people lived there. It was a major port, an industrial center, and importantly, it was a military headquarters. The Japanese Second Army was based there, and it served as a communications center. But compared to other Japanese cities, Hiroshima had been relatively untouched by American bombing raids. Sure, there had been some minor attacks, but nothing like what Tokyo or Osaka or Nagoya had experienced. The city was mostly intact. People went about their lives, as much as anyone could during wartime. Yamaguchi had been sent there in early August for a business trip, a work assignment that was supposed to last about 3 months. He was helping design a new type of oil tanker for the Navy. By August 6th, he'd been in Hiroshima for about 3 months, and his assignment, it was coming to an end. In fact, August 6th was supposed to be his last full day there. His train back to Nagasaki, it was scheduled for the next morning, August 7th. He was going home. That morning, August 6th, it started like any other morning during the war. Hot, you know. It was summer, early August in southern Japan, so it was hot and humid. Yamaguchi woke up in the company housing where he'd been staying. He got ready for work, got dressed, probably had a simple breakfast. Rice, maybe some pickled vegetables, some tea, whatever rations allowed. And then he headed out. The walk to the shipyard, it took him through residential areas, past other workers heading to their jobs, past shopkeepers opening up their stores, past mothers with children. Normal life, or as normal as life could be in 1945 Japan. People were tired, hungry. The war had gone on too long, taken too much, but they kept going. That's what you did. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, Yamaguchi was making his way to the shipyard when he realized he'd forgotten something. His hanko, his personal seal stamp. In Japan, you needed this for official documents, for signing papers at work. And on his last day, he knew he'd needed to finalize his departure paperwork. So he turned around, started heading back to get it. And that decision, that simple, mundane decision to go back for a forgotten stamp, it saved his life. But it also meant he'd be outside, completely exposed, when it happened. It was 8:15 a.m. Yamaguchi was walking through an area with some potato fields, relatively open ground, maybe a mile and a half from the city center. And he heard it, the sound of aircraft engines. Not unusual, you understand. American B-29s had been flying reconnaissance missions over Hiroshima, and people had gotten used to seeing them. Air raid sirens would go off, people would take shelter, planes would fly over, take photographs, and leave. It had happened the day before, and the day before that. But this morning, there was something different. Yamaguchi looked up, saw the B-29, just one bomber, the Enola Gay, though he wouldn't know that name until much later. He saw something fall from the plane, a small object tumbling through the sky. He thought maybe it was a parachute, a crewman bailing out. For a moment, he watched it fall. And then, the flash. Yamaguchi described it later as a magnesium flash, like a photographer's flashbulb, but magnified 1,000,000 times. A light so bright it seemed to fill the entire world, so bright it seared itself into his vision even through his closed eyelids. For an instant, just an instant, everything was white, pure white, whiter than anything he'd ever seen. And then, the heat. The thermal radiation from the bomb, it traveled at the speed of light. The surface temperature at the hypocenter, at ground zero, directly beneath the explosion, it reached about 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize human beings, to melt stone, to set wood and paper ablaze instantly. Even where Yamaguchi was standing more than a mile away from the hypocenter, the heat was unimaginable. He threw himself to the ground, face down, an instinctive reaction, and he felt it wash over him, felt his skin burning on his left side, the side facing the blast. His face, his left arm, his left leg, the exposed skin it started to burn. He described it as feeling like he'd been splashed with boiling oil. Then came the blast wave. See, the light and heat, they traveled at the speed of light. But the actual shock wave, the physical force of the explosion, that traveled at the speed of sound. So there was this gap, just a few seconds, where Yamaguchi lay there, his skin burning, and then the wall of air hit him. The pressure wave from Little Boy, that's what they call the bomb, Little Boy, it was traveling at over 600 miles per hour when it reached Yamaguchi's position. Imagine that. Imagine a hurricane-force wind, stronger than any typhoon, hitting you all at once. It picked him up off the ground, threw him through the air like he weighed nothing. He landed hard, maybe 10, 15 feet from where he'd been, and the world, it just exploded around him. The sound. He said later he couldn't really remember the sound. Maybe it was too loud for his brain to process. Maybe the shock just erased it from his memory. But he remembered the wind, the debris flying through the air, pieces of buildings, pieces of trees, pieces of other things. And then, as quickly as it had come, silence. Well, not silence exactly. His ears were ringing, probably ruptured eardrums from the pressure. But compared to the blast, compared to that moment of catastrophic violence, it seemed silent. Yamaguchi, he lay there. Couldn't move at first, couldn't think. His left side was in agony, burned badly. Later, doctors would classify his burns as second-degree burns, maybe bordering on third degree in some spots. The kind of burns that they destroy the upper layers of skin, leave you raw and exposed. And he was bleeding, cut by flying debris, bruised all over from being thrown through the air. But he was alive. Slowly, very slowly, he managed to sit up, and what he saw, it wasn't the Hiroshima that he'd walked through that morning. The entire city, it was gone. Where there had been buildings, homes, shops, streetcars, people, there was just devastation. Flattened. Everything flattened, and fires everywhere, hundreds of fires starting to merge into one massive conflagration. The mushroom cloud. He could see it rising above the city, this massive tower of smoke and debris and fire, climbing up into the sky, growing wider at the top, shaped like some kind of monstrous mushroom. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, this thing humans had created. Yamaguchi, he started walking, or stumbling, really. He had to get away from the fires, had to find help, He didn't know what he had to do, but he couldn't just stay there. His burns were excruciating, his clothes were in tatters, and he was in shock, deep shock. The things he saw as he made his way through the ruins, he didn't talk about them much, not in detail. People who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many of them couldn't speak about what they witnessed. The dead and the dying were everywhere, you understand. People burned so badly they didn't look human anymore. People with their skin hanging off in sheets. People crying out for water, for help, for their mothers. Children wandering alone, looking for their parents. Mothers holding dead children. There's a term for the survivors of the atomic bombings, hibakusha. It means explosion-affected people. And Yamaguchi, burned, bleeding, traumatized. He was one of them now. Somehow, through the chaos and the destruction, he found two of his colleagues from Mitsubishi, two other engineers who'd been in Hiroshima for the same assignment, Akira Iwanaga and Kunyoshi Sato. They'd survived too, though they were also injured. And together, the three of them, they made a decision. They had to get out of Hiroshima. They had to get home to Nagasaki. The train station, it was damaged but still partially functional. The rail lines going south, going away from Hiroshima, they were intact enough. And that night, August 6th, as Hiroshima burned, as thousands died from their injuries, as the scale of the catastrophe was just beginning to become clear, Yamaguchi and his colleagues got on a train heading south. The journey took all night. The train was packed with injured people, with refugees fleeing the destruction. There was no medical care to speak of, no water, no food. People were dying on that train, right there in the cars, from their injuries, from shock, from radiation sickness, though nobody understood what that was yet. Yamaguchi sat there, his burns untreated, his body shutting down from trauma, and somehow he survived the trip. August 7th, early morning, the train pulled into Nagasaki Station. Home. Yamaguchi was home. His wife, Hisako, she was there, waiting, praying he'd made it back. When she saw him, saw his burns, his condition, she was horrified. She got him to a doctor, got his wounds treated as best they could be. The burns were cleaned, bandaged. He was given something for the pain, though supplies were limited. The doctor told him to rest, to stay in bed. He'd survived something unimaginable, and his body needed time to heal. Yamaguchi, he tried. He spent August 7th and 8th at home, recovering. His wife took care of him, kept the bandages clean, made sure he ate what little food they had. His son, little Katsutoshi, too young to understand what had happened, played nearby. And Yamaguchi, he tried to explain to people what he'd seen, tried to tell them about the bomb, about the flash, about the city disappearing. But how do you explain something like that? How do you make people understand? One bomb, just one bomb, and an entire city was gone. It seemed impossible. Some people thought he was exaggerating, that he'd been caught in a particularly bad firebombing raid. But he knew what he'd seen. He knew. August 9th, 3 days after Hiroshima. Yamaguchi, he was still recovering, still burned, still in pain, but he was a dedicated employee, you understand. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was important war work, and even injured, even traumatized, he felt obligated to report to his supervisor, to explain why he was back early, to finish his paperwork from the Hiroshima assignment. So that morning, August 9th, he went to work, went to the Mitsubishi plant in Nagasaki. His section chief, his manager, was there, and Yamaguchi, bandaged, burned, barely able to move, he started to tell his story, started to explain about Hiroshima, about the bomb, about the flash and the heat and the city vanishing. His manager, he was skeptical. One bomb destroyed an entire city? That didn't make sense. That wasn't possible. Sure, the Americans had been developing powerful weapons, but one bomb? Yamaguchi insisted. He'd been there. He'd seen it. One bomb, one plane, the entire city, gone. It was about 11 in the morning. They were in the office, discussing this, arguing about it, maybe. And then, through the window, Yamaguchi saw it again. The flash, that same magnesium brightness, that same impossible light, filling the sky, filling the world. And in that instant, in that terrible instant, Yamaguchi knew. He knew exactly what it was, knew exactly what was about to happen, and he had maybe 2-3 seconds before the blast wave would hit. He threw himself to the ground, dove under a desk, and screamed at everyone else to do the same. Some listened. Some didn't have time. The blast wave hit the Mitsubishi plant. The building shook. Windows exploded inward in a shower of glass, walls cracked, the ceiling partially collapsed. The sound was deafening, that same overwhelming roar of destruction. And then, the heat, that same terrible heat, washing over everything, setting fires, burning exposed skin. When it was over, when the shaking stopped and the roar faded, Yamaguchi crawled out from under the desk. His fresh bandages were dirty. Some of them had come off. His burns were bleeding again. And he looked around the office. Some people were dead, killed by flying debris or the blast itself. Others were injured, bleeding, burned. His manager, his skeptical manager who hadn't believed his story, he was staring at Yamaguchi with wide eyes, with terror and understanding. Yamaguchi had been right. It had happened again. Nagasaki, it wasn't quite the same level of destruction as Hiroshima, though that's small comfort to anyone who was there. The bomb, Fat Man, they called this one, was actually more powerful than Little Boy. But Nagasaki's geography, the hills and valleys, they channeled the blast, contained it somewhat. The Mitsubishi plant where Yamaguchi worked, it was in the Urakami Valley, which took the brunt of the explosion. About 40,000 people died instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll would reach about 70,000. Yamaguchi, he was about 2 miles from the hypocenter this time, a bit farther than he'd been in Hiroshima, and he'd had those crucial few seconds of warning, enough time to take cover. That saved his life again. But he was injured again. More trauma added to his already damaged body, his burns aggravated, new cuts and bruises. And he had to get home, had to make sure his wife and son were safe. The journey through Nagasaki after the bombing, it was Hiroshima all over again. The same devastation, the same fires, the same dying people, the same nightmare. Except this time, it was his city, his home, his neighbors. Yamaguchi stumbled through the ruins, making his way toward his house. And somehow, miraculously, his house was still standing. It was damaged, windows broken, walls cracked, but standing. And inside, his wife and son were alive. They'd been far enough from the hypocenter, had taken shelter when they heard the air raid sirens. But Hisako, his wife, she'd been outside for a moment when the flash came. She'd been burned too, though not as severely as her husband. And the baby, Katsutoshi, he seemed okay, protected by the walls of the house. So there they were, the Yamaguchi family. Tsutomu had survived both atomic bombings. His wife had survived one, their infant son had survived one. They were hibakusha, all of them now, marked by the atomic age. The next few days, they were chaos. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 6 days after Nagasaki. The war was over, but for the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the suffering, it was just beginning. Radiation sickness. Nobody really understood it at the time, you see. They knew people were getting sick, dying days or weeks after the bombings, even people who hadn't been directly injured by the blast itself. Hair falling out, bleeding gums, nausea, fevers, weakness. Now we know these are symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, caused by exposure to the intense radiation released by the bombs. But then it was a mystery, another horror added to everything else. Yamaguchi, he got sick, very sick. The radiation exposure from Hiroshima and Nagasaki both, it attacked his body at a cellular level. He lost his hair, bled from his gums, ran high fevers. There were days his family thought he wouldn't make it, days he probably wanted to give up, but he didn't. He survived. Again. His recovery, it took months, years really, to get back to something approaching normal. His burns healed, slowly, leaving scars that he'd carry for the rest of his life. The radiation sickness eventually receded, though he'd deal with health problems related to the exposure for decades. His wife recovered too. Their son grew up relatively healthy, though there were always worries about the long-term effects of radiation exposure in utero. And Yamaguchi, he went back to work, back to Mitsubishi, back to designing ships. He needed to support his family, needed to rebuild his life. What else could he do? The war was over, Japan was occupied by American forces, everything had changed, but life went on. It had to. For years, decades really, Yamaguchi didn't talk much about what he'd experienced. Many hibakusha didn't. There was a stigma attached to being a survivor of the atomic bombings, you understand? People feared that radiation exposure was contagious or that hibakusha were somehow contaminated. Some survivors had trouble finding work, finding spouses. There was shame mixed with the trauma, which seems cruel, but that was the reality. Yamaguchi focused on his family, his work, his life. He and Hisako had 2 more children, daughters, both healthy. They lived in Nagasaki, in the city that had been destroyed and then rebuilt. And Yamaguchi, he carried the memories of those 2 days, August 6th and August 9th, 1945. The flash, the heat, the destruction, the deaths, all of it locked away. But as he got older, as the years passed, as the hibakusha began to die off, Yamaguchi realized something. His story, his experience, it was unique. He'd been in both cities, survived both bombings. As far as anyone knew, he was the only person who'd experienced both atomic bombs and lived to tell about it. Oh, there were others who'd been in both cities, but they died in the second blast or from their injuries. Yamaguchi, he'd survived both, twice marked by the atomic age. In his later years, Yamaguchi became an advocate for nuclear disarmament. He started speaking publicly about his experiences, talking to schools, to organizations, to anyone who would listen. He wanted people to understand what nuclear weapons actually did, what they meant. Not in abstract terms, not as military strategy or political deterrence, but as human suffering, as cities full of people vaporized in an instant, as children dying of radiation sickness, as scars that never fully healed. He spoke at the United Nations, testified before various groups, wrote about his experiences, and he was always clear about his message. Nuclear weapons must never be used again. Never. What happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it couldn't be allowed to happen to any other city, any other people. In 2009, at age 93, Yamaguchi was officially recognized by the Japanese government as a Niju Hibakusha, a twice-bombed person. the only person officially recognized as surviving both atomic bombings. It had taken 64 years for his unique status to be acknowledged, but there it was, official recognition of what he'd endured. Tsutomu Yamaguchi died on January 4, 2010. He was 93 years old. The cause of death was stomach cancer, likely related to his radiation exposure more than 6 decades earlier. He'd lived a long life, considering everything, longer than most hibakusha. He'd raised a family, had a career, saw his grandchildren grow up, and he'd spent his final years trying to make sure the world remembered, trying to make sure it never happened again. His story, it raises questions, doesn't it? About chance, about fate, about human resilience. What are the odds? What are the actual mathematical odds of being in Hiroshima on August 6th, surviving, going to Nagasaki and being there on August 9th and surviving again? It's almost incomprehensible. Some people called him the unluckiest man in the world, to be in both cities on those specific days. Others called him the luckiest man in the world, to survive both bombings when so many hundreds of thousands didn't. Maybe he was both. Maybe luck doesn't really cover it at all. Think about the small decisions that kept him alive. Turning back to get his hanko in Hiroshima, which meant he was farther from the hypocenter and in a more open area. Going to work on August 9th in Nagasaki, despite his injuries, which meant he was in a reinforced industrial building rather than a residential area. Recognizing the flash the second time and taking cover. Any one of those decisions goes differently. Any one of those moments plays out another way, and Yamaguchi dies. His story ends. We never hear about the man who survived both bombings because he didn't survive. But he did. Against all odds, against all probability, he survived. And not just survived, but lived. Truly lived. Raised a family, held down a job, found moments of happiness amid the trauma and the memories and the scars. That's remarkable. That says something about the human capacity to endure, to persist, to keep going even when everything tells you to give up. The numbers. Let's talk about the numbers for a moment because I think it's important to understand the scale of what Yamaguchi witnessed twice. In Hiroshima, estimates vary, but somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people died immediately from the blast, the heat, and the initial radiation. By the end of 1945, that number had climbed to about 140,000 as people succumbed to their injuries and radiation sickness. In Nagasaki, about 40,000 died immediately, with the total reaching about 70,000 by year's end. Combined, the two bombs killed over 200,000 people, most of them civilians, old people, children, babies, mothers, fathers, teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers, students. Just people. People going about their lives on what they thought would be an ordinary day. And Yamaguchi, he saw it all. Twice. He saw the flash that killed tens of thousands in an instant, saw the fires that burned the cities, saw the people dying, heard their cries, walked through the ruins, and he carried that with him for the rest of his life. There's something profoundly significant about his story in our current age. We live in a world that still has nuclear weapons, you understand. Thousands of them, far more powerful than Little Boy or Fat Man. Countries pointing them at each other, deterrence they call it, mutually assured destruction. And most people today, they don't really think about what these weapons do. They're abstract, hypothetical, numbers on a screen. But Yamaguchi, he knew. He knew exactly what they do. He'd felt the heat, seen the light, walked through the aftermath. Twice. And he spent his final years trying to tell us, trying to warn us, Never again, he said. These weapons must never be used again. His wife, Hisako, she died in 2008, 2 years before Tsutomu. She lived with her own scars from Nagasaki, her own memories, her own trauma. But together, they'd built a life. Their son, Katsutoshi, who'd been an infant during the bombings, he grew up and had his own family. The Yamaguchi line continued, which in itself feels like a small victory against the bombs that tried to end it. The Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant where Yamaguchi worked in Nagasaki, parts of it are still standing. You can visit the site, see the preserved ruins. There are memorials in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, museums dedicated to preserving the history, to making sure people remember. Every August 6th and 9th, there are ceremonies, moments of silence at exactly 8:15 a.m. and 11:02 a.m. respectively, the times the bombs detonated. And somewhere in those memorials, in that history, is Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story, the man who survived both, the man who lived to tell about it, the man who refused to let the world forget. You know, when you really sit with his story, when you let it sink in, it changes how you think about history. These aren't just dates and numbers and strategic decisions made by generals and politicians. This is human experience, human suffering, human endurance. Yamaguchi wasn't a soldier, wasn't a decision maker in the war. He was just a guy, a naval engineer, trying to do his job, trying to get home to his family. And the atomic age? It came for him anyway. Twice. But here's the thing. Here's what I think is important to remember. Yamaguchi could have given up. After Hiroshima, after surviving that unimaginable horror, he could have just stopped. Could have succumbed to his injuries, to the trauma, to the radiation sickness. Nobody would have blamed him. And then after Nagasaki, after being bombed again, after the universe seemed to be specifically targeting him, he could have given up then too. But he didn't. He chose to live, chose to heal, to rebuild, to keep going. And later, when he could have stayed silent, could have tried to forget, to move on, he chose to remember instead, chose to speak up, to educate, to warn. He turned his suffering into a message, his survival into a mission. That's courage, real courage. Not the kind of courage that's loud and dramatic, the quiet kind. The kind that gets you out of bed every day when your body is scarred and your mind is haunted. The kind that lets you look at the worst of what humanity can do and still choose to believe in humanity's better nature. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they remain the only times nuclear weapons have been used in warfare. The only times in over 80 years since then. And maybe that's partly because of people like Yamaguchi, people who survived, who bore witness, who said, "This must never happen again," and meant it, who made the abstract concrete, who put a human face on nuclear warfare. His story, it's a reminder that behind every historical event, every date you learned in school, every statistic you read, there are individual human beings, people with names, with families, with hopes and dreams and fears, people whose lives were forever changed by forces beyond their control. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, born March 16, 1916 in Nagasaki, died January 4, 2010 in Nagasaki. The man who survived both atomic bombings, the Niju Hibakusha, the twice-bombed man. His life spanned nearly a century. He saw the rise of militarism in Japan, the expansion of the empire, the Second World War, the atomic age, Japan's defeat and reconstruction, the economic miracle, the modern era. He saw so much change, experienced so much history. But those 2 days, August 6th and August 9th, 1945, those defined him in a way nothing else could. And now, 80 years later, his story endures. It's being told again right now to you. And that matters. That's important. Because as long as we remember, as long as we tell these stories, as long as we bear witness to what happened, there's a chance, however small, that we won't repeat it. Yamaguchi believed that. He had to believe it, had to believe his suffering meant something, that his survival had a purpose. And maybe it did. Maybe telling his story, sharing what he experienced, educating people about the true horrors of nuclear weapons, maybe that's helped keep them from being used again. We can't know for sure. We can't measure the impact of one man's testimony against the vast machinery of global politics and military strategy. But we can remember, we can listen, we can understand that nuclear weapons aren't just numbers and megatons and strategic deterrents. They're Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're Tsutomu Yamaguchi, burned and bleeding and traumatized. They're hundreds of thousands of people who never got the chance to tell their stories because they didn't survive. So here we are, at the end of this story that isn't really an end at all. Yamaguchi's message, his warning, his plea, it continues. It has to continue. Because the bombs still exist. The threat still exists. And the only thing standing between us and another Hiroshima, another Nagasaki, another city full of people vanishing in a flash of light is our collective memory, our collective will to prevent it. Yamaguchi did his part. He survived the impossible twice. He lived to tell about it. He raised his voice, shared his story, tried to make the world understand. Now it's up to us to listen, to remember, to make sure his survival, his testimony, his life, that it meant something. The man who survived both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He's gone now, but his story remains. And as long as it does, as long as we keep telling it, keep remembering what happened on those 2 terrible days in August 1945, there's hope. Hope that it never happens again. So if this story got you thinking, if it pulled you in, there's another mystery from World War II I covered that I think you'd find just as compelling. Just click the up there, and I'll see you there.